Welcome back to Mr. Haden's Ag Lessons. This is episode number 12 and we're talking about composting. I'll break it down for you. Welcome back, crew. Glad to have you back. We're still in my basement and we're talking about a very important topic, composting. I know a lot of you are in quarantine and you've been doing the dishes and maybe throwing away a lot of food waste, but we're going to teach you how to better utilize that and then help you maybe gain some better garden soil for those gardens we taught you about. So first off, what is composting? Composting, there's our first sump pump of the day. We're going to hear from R&R Cafe. You have to be over the age of 60 to even enter. And so when we're talking about composting, we're talking about the breaking down of plant and animal material. Mainly, we're talking about plant material. And two of those common terms you're going to hear with composting are greens and browns, okay? Green is fresh plant material, so that could be things like fruit and vegetables that you have left over or scraps from your table or your dinner. Browns are going to be plant material that's been dead a while. So it could be sticks, it could be leaves from last fall, it could be straw, it could be roots, things of that nature. But the reason that we have greens and browns is we want a good mix of both, about 50 and 50 when we're making our compost pile. And when I say pile, I should clarify a little bit more there. There's two kind of different ways to compost. Some people to choose have a upright, or I should say a sideways, like a barrel or drum that's plastic. They put their compost materials in there, and some people prefer to just have a pile on the ground surrounded by wood. We'll talk about some of the things we need to make sure we do to be able to break that down correctly in an adequate amount of time. So we talked a little about the greens and the browns there in terms of that. The other thing you have to know are two terms or two elements. We're going to talk about carbon and nitrogen, okay? We mainly want a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 25 to 1, okay? So 25 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen. And that carbon is the basis of all life. All living things contain carbon, and we break those down over time. It releases the nutrients and building blocks that all plants are made of. So if you see right here, we have a couple different ratios of some common household items. We have wood has a 30 to 1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen. Shredded newspaper, and the key word there is shredded, okay? If I have newspaper that I want to compost, I don't want it just stacked on top of each other and really thick and dense, okay? I want it shredded, that way those decomposers can get at it, and I want to stay away from a lot of glossy newspapers. So if you think about ads and things like that, so just your standard newspaper. Sawdust, 325 to 1. Now, I'm not telling you to have a compost pile full of sawdust, because we'll talk about we want that range, that 25 to 30 parts per 1 part nitrogen, okay? And so when we're looking at that, we also have grass clippings have 20 to 1, and that's probably the largest volume amount of material. If you have a yard, you're going to create a lot of grass clippings every summer, okay? And so if we have too little carbon, okay, if that ratio is too low, we're not going to have a very quick decomposition of the materials in there. If the carbon ratio is too high, you're actually going to start to get a kind of a foul smell, foul odor, and we don't really want that. So if you're worried about the smell with this, if you do it correctly, you should be able to limit that, okay? And one of the other methods when we're layering the different types of materials, you might have a layer of the greens material, a layer of brown, and then I like to, personally, if you put in a little bit of soil, and that introduces some of those decomposers that would be found naturally in the soil, find some of your richest, darkest soil. That's going to be your most healthy soil, and it's going to have the most diversity in terms of living organisms, okay? But we also need a couple different things here. We got to make sure that we need the fungi, bacteria, the insects. Obviously, a lot of you are familiar with worms and how they digest different dead plant material. And then we need the right mixture of plant material, water, and air, okay? What I mean by that is we don't want this thing jam-packed, and we don't want it so air can't move through it, okay? A lot of people will turn up their decomposition pile, their composting pile with like a pitchfork from time to time, and that definitely helps get air into there, okay? That air, we don't want anaerobic, meaning the lack of oxygen. We want aerobic breakdown of those materials, okay? And we also want about 40 to 60% moisture in that compost pile. And a lot of you, if you have a garden, you have a water source nearby. If you go through a really dry spell in the middle of summer, you can go ahead and spray that compost pile down. And you might also notice that when we have that breakdown of those materials, in the early mornings, especially in the spring or in the fall, you'll actually see steam rising from the pile. Now, that's nothing to be alarmed about, okay? That's just there. That means the decomposition is happening. And different temperatures result in higher rates of decomposition, okay? Now, this whole process, it might take between 4 to 8 weeks to break something down, but you're constantly adding new material and your decomposed material more towards the bottom. If you mix it up, it helps speed up that decomposition, okay? And so we already talked a little about the location. Have it somewhere where you're not walking a really long ways away to throw those food scraps, but also somewhere where the end use of that soil that's decomposed, when you have that material, that's that humus, okay, that organic matter to add to your garden, which is extremely rich in nutrients, you don't have to haul it a long ways, okay? And so we're also, when we talk about there's different phases, and this is something I wasn't aware of, I did a little homework, as you can see. The mesophilic phase is when the temperatures are moderate, and that's mainly our bacterial phase. The thermophilic is when we have an increase in temperature, and then the maturation stage of that compost pile is when the compounds, they start to dwindle, the temperature starts to drop, and it gets closer to being able to use that compost, okay? Now, I know you're thinking today's lessons has been a lot of trash talk in it, but we are talking about common waste products and how to reduce the amount of those products that might end up in a landfill or some area where they're not utilized. It's great for use in gardens and putting back that material. Now, a common question I get is, what about animal manure? You can have some animal manure. Sometimes cat and dog fecal material is not recommended. More things like our ruminant animals like cattle manure, and it doesn't take a lot of it, okay, guys? You don't want to overdo it, especially sometimes there can be a high salt content with cattle manure, so please be aware there. And then everyone's favorite little wriggly creature, worms, right? Okay, we talk about how the worms, they have an extremely good sense of smell. They will smell that material that's breaking down, and if you have a bare soil floor area, they will actually, they'll smell that decomposing material. And that is our second sump pump of the day. We're hearing from Fueling Chiropractic. When you don't line up right, we'll put you in your place. Okay, and then so if you have a bare soil there, not like a concrete base, that allows some of those worms to get up in that compost pile. And, you know, especially if you're a fisherman, maybe you can find some worms. Shout out to Todd Reed and Keith Donnelly with the Indy Bass Club. I know they might use fake worms, but every once in a while, I bet they like a good old fresh worm, I guess you could say. And then so you can, when we add worms to it, that's actually called vermiculture, where we're producing worms. And a lot of you won't do that, but it would help you a little bit. When they do take over the world, it's going to be called global warming, which I know that's not as big a fear as global warming, but just think about that in your mind a little bit, okay? And then so if you have an elevated composter, you do have to be aware that when this is off the ground, that plastic barrel, when the sunlight is beating down on it, it might get hot more quickly and you might lose more moisture. You don't want it sealed completely. Like we said, we want a lot of oxygen moving through it. And there is a special, the only advantage, I shouldn't say only, but with a plastic barrel like that, there is a thing called composting tea. And what that is some developing countries, they don't have synthetic fertilizers that we can go buy at some home goods stores, or they can buy at their local co-ops. So what they do is they'll have their compost pile, and they will actually run a lot of water through it, but they will capture all of that water. And when that water moves through the compost pile, it takes the soluble nutrients that get into that water, okay, and it carries them out of that pile. So when we're talking about soluble nutrients that are readily available for uptake by the plant. And so it's kind of like a Kool-Aid mixture for plants. When you get those nutrients in solution, you collect that water and then you put it over your garden. It's an extremely good fertilizer, okay? Now, the thing I want you to remember, kids, is when you compost, or I should say, remember, kids, compost, because a good rind is a terrible thing to waste, okay? So we have covered a little bit over composting today. Like I said, we've covered a lot about gardening. We've had plants and a variety of different animals. Please keep commenting in the commenting section of these videos to help me get more topics, and we will see you next time.